In October 1914, thousands of people around the world believed they were living through the final hours of human civilization. Some had sold their homes. Others had abandoned careers, marriages, retirement plans. Why build a future that God Himself had scheduled for demolition? They had been told, not suggested, not hinted, told, that a specific year had been encoded in the Bible. Not a season, not a generation, a year, 1914. But when that year came, the world didn't end. Governments didn't fall. The dead stayed dead. Armageddon never arrived. What did arrive was something no one predicted: the First World War. And that coincidence would become the most powerful tool the organization ever possessed. Because instead of admitting the prophecy failed, they did something far more audacious. They rewrote it. They turned the failure into the foundation. And they built an empire on top of the rubble. Today, more than a century later, millions of Jehovah's Witnesses still believe 1914 was the most important year in human history. The year Jesus Christ began ruling as King in heaven, invisibly. But here's what they don't tell you at the door. The original prediction had nothing to do with an invisible kingdom. The math behind the date depends on a historical claim that virtually every scholar on earth rejects. And the reinterpretation? It was written after the failure, not before. This is not just a video about a century-old miscalculation. This is about how a power structure survives when its foundation rots from the inside. And why, for millions of people, historical truth has become the greatest sin you can commit. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's documented, and it changes everything. Part 1. The world that created the prophecy. To understand 1914, you have to understand 19th century America. Specifically, you have to understand a nation drunk on the end of the world. The 1800s in the United States were an era of extraordinary religious ferment. New denominations were born almost every decade. Preachers traveled from town to town claiming they had cracked hidden codes in the Bible, codes that revealed exactly when God would intervene in human affairs. This wasn't fringe behavior. It was mainstream. Millions of Americans genuinely believed that biblical prophecy could be solved like an equation. Find the right starting date, apply the right formula, calculate the return of Christ down to the calendar year. And the most famous attempt came from William Miller, a Baptist preacher from New York. Miller spent years studying the book of Daniel and concluded that Christ would return in 1843. When that year passed without incident, his followers adjusted the date to October 22, 1844. Tens of thousands believed him. Farmers refused to harvest their crops. Families gave away everything they owned. Why hold on to anything when paradise was days away? And then October 22nd came and went. The sun rose the next morning on a world that looked exactly the same. That event became known as the Great Disappointment, and it should have been the end of the story. But here's what's fascinating. It wasn't. The impulse didn't die. It scattered, like seeds after a wildfire. Some former Millerites went on to form the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Others drifted into smaller splinter groups, each one carrying the same unshakable conviction: that the Bible contained a hidden countdown and that someone, eventually, would get the math right. So ask yourself this: if a prediction fails catastrophically in front of tens of thousands of witnesses, and the response is not to abandon the method, but to try again with different numbers, what does that tell you about the psychology behind the belief? Hold that question, because the next man to try the math would get results that still shape millions of lives today. Part 2. The man behind the date. Charles Taze Russell was not a trained theologian. He had no degree in biblical languages, no background in ancient history. What he had was money from his father's clothing business, relentless ambition, and a personal crisis that pushed him deep into religion. As a young man, Russell had lost faith in traditional Christianity. The doctrine of hellfire repelled him, the idea that a loving God would burn people forever. That revulsion didn't push him away from religion. It pulled him deeper in. He began attending Bible study groups, many of them shaped by the same Adventist thinking that had produced William Miller's failed prediction. And then, Russell met a man named Nelson Barber. Barber had developed his own prophetic timeline. He believed Christ had already returned, invisibly, in 1874, and that the final end of the age would arrive in 1914. Russell was electrified. He saw in Barber's framework something he had been looking for: a system, not just a guess. A theological architecture that connected Old Testament chronology, prophetic symbolism, and the book of Daniel into one unified, testable timeline. He partnered with Barber, he funded the publications, and then he built something larger than either of them had imagined, a movement organized entirely around a single date. But here's the part that matters for what comes later. Russell didn't present 1914 as a theory. He presented it as divine engineering, as God's own countdown clock, hidden in plain sight for centuries, finally decoded by the right students of Scripture. That distinction between a prediction and a revelation is what made the eventual failure so catastrophic and so profitable, because you can walk away from a prediction. Walking away from a revelation means walking away from God. Part 3. The math behind 1914. Now, this is the section where most people's eyes glaze over. Prophetic calculations sound abstract, but I need you to follow this, because once you see how the date was built, you'll see exactly where it breaks. The calculation starts in the book of Daniel, chapter 4. King Nebuchadnezzar has a prophetic dream about a great tree that is chopped down and banded with iron and bronze. The tree is left in that condition for what the text calls 7 times. Most Bible scholars read this as a story about Nebuchadnezzar himself, his temporary madness, after which his kingdom was restored. A local story about a local king. But Russell's group saw something cosmic. They believed the tree represented God's rulership on earth, and the 7 times represented a vast prophetic period, a countdown to the restoration of God's kingdom. So how long are 7 times? They turn to Revelation chapter 12, which mentions 1,260 days described as a time, times, and half a time, 3.5 times. If 3.5 times equals 1,260 days, then 7 times equals 2,520 days. Next came the leap. They applied what's called the year-day principle, drawn from Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6. The idea that in prophecy, 1 day stands for 1 year. So 2,520 days became 2,520 years. It might sound confusing, but for Russell's followers, this wasn't theology. It was divine engineering. They weren't interpreting the Bible. They believed they were decoding the universe. The final step was choosing a starting point. Russell placed the beginning of the 7 times at the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, an event he dated to 607 B.C.E. Start at 607. Count forward 2,520 years. You arrive at 1914. That was the formula. Elegant, specific, seemingly airtight. But remember what they expected to happen in 1914. Not an invisible heavenly event, not a subtle spiritual shift. They expected the visible, catastrophic end of all human governments. Armageddon. The physical kingdom of God on earth. The resurrection of the dead. They said so in print, repeatedly, for decades, with absolute confidence. And what happened next is something the organization has spent over a century trying to rewrite. Part 4. The weight of certainty. In the years leading up to 1914, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society didn't treat the date as a possibility. They treated it as fact. The language in their publications was unambiguous. The Gentile times would end in 1914. God's kingdom would take full control. The old world order would be swept away. For ordinary members, this wasn't abstract theology. It was a life plan. Think about what it means to truly believe the world will end in a specific year. It changes everything. It changes whether you pursue an education, whether you save for retirement, whether you invest in relationships outside the group. Why build anything permanent when permanence itself is about to be erased? And many gave generously. Some gave everything: businesses, savings, property. The closer 1914 came, the more intense the expectation grew. Russell projected supreme confidence. His theological system, his publications, his reputation, everything pointed to this single year. But here's the tension that was building underneath the certainty, the tension no one wanted to name. Russell had also set prophetic significance on 1874, 1878, and 1881. Each of those dates had passed without the expected events materializing. Each time, the explanation was adjusted. Each time, the followers stayed. So by the time 1914 arrived, there was already a pattern in place. A pattern of prediction, failure, and reinterpretation. A pattern the members had been trained not to recognize. And then the year came. Part 5. What actually happened? In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. By August, the major European powers were at war. Within months, the conflict had engulfed the continent and pulled in nations from around the globe. The First World War had begun. For Russell's followers, the timing was electrifying. War on an unprecedented scale, empires trembling. It seemed like confirmation. The world really was falling apart, but not the way they had predicted. Armageddon didn't come. Human governments didn't vanish. The dead stayed in their graves. Christ didn't take visible control of the earth. The war was devastating, but it was a human war, caused by human politics, ended by human treaties. October 1914 passed, then November, then December. The year ended. The world was still here. The calculation failed. The world continued. But the doctrine stayed. Russell died in 1916, just 2 years later, without ever fully resolving the contradiction. But even in those final years, the machinery of reinterpretation had already begun to turn. And the man who took the wheel after Russell would turn that machinery into something far more powerful than a correct prediction could ever have been. Joseph Franklin Rutherford seized control of the organization after Russell's death. He was a different kind of leader, harder, more authoritarian, more willing to rewrite whatever needed rewriting. And the first thing that needed rewriting was 1914. Here was the new teaching. Jesus Christ had indeed returned in 1914. He had begun ruling as king in heaven, but, and this is the crucial word, invisibly. His kingdom was real, but it operated in the spiritual realm, not the physical one. The signs of his presence? War, famine, pestilence, earthquakes. All the suffering that had defined the 20th century, that was the evidence. The turmoil wasn't proof that the prophecy had failed. It was proof that Satan had been cast down from heaven and was now raging on earth. Do you see the elegance of this move? The very things that seemed to disprove the prediction, ongoing misery, persistent governments, the total absence of paradise, were reframed as confirmation. It was theological judo. The opponent's force was used against him. Every objection became evidence. Every failure became fulfillment. And there was something else. If 1914 marked the beginning of the last days, then the final end was still coming. Soon. Imminently. Every war, every earthquake, every pandemic was another sign that the clock was running out. This created a permanent engine of urgency. Not the sharp, date-specific urgency of the pre-1914 period, but something more diffuse and more durable. A low-grade apocalyptic anxiety that could be sustained indefinitely. And that anxiety became the fuel for everything. Recruitment, donations, door-to-door preaching, obedience. If the end could come at any moment, there was no time to question, no time to doubt, no time to check whether the foundation of the whole system was actually solid. But what if someone did check? What would they find? Nobody talks about. This is the part the organization hopes you never reach, because this is where the math meets the real world. And the real world doesn't negotiate. The entire calculation, every step, every symbolic interpretation, every layer of prophetic reasoning, depends on one specific historical claim, that Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in 607 B.C.E. If that date is correct, the math works. 607 plus 2520 equals 1914. But virtually every historian, archaeologist, and ancient Near Eastern scholar in the world places the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 or 586 B.C.E., 20 years later. This isn't a minority opinion. It isn't a contested debate among specialists. It is one of the most securely established dates in ancient history. The evidence comes from multiple independent, cross-verified sources. And this is important. We are not talking about competing interpretations of an ancient text. We are talking about thousands of commercial receipts, payment records, and astronomical diaries from Babylon itself, all converging on the same point. Cuneiform tablets written by the Babylonians in their own hand record the fall of Jerusalem with remarkable precision. Astronomical diaries, records of lunar eclipses, planetary positions, and solstices, can be checked against modern calculations and anchor the chronology in ways that leave virtually no room for a 20-year gap. Egyptian records corroborate the timeline, and even the Bible's own internal chronology. The reign lengths recorded in Kings and Chronicles aligns with 587, not 607. For 607 to be correct, modern astronomy would have to be wrong. Every cuneiform scholar on Earth would have to be wrong. The Babylonians themselves would have to have been wrong about their own records. Here, the conflict stops being about two interpretations of the Bible. It becomes a conflict between an organization and material reality. On one side, every library, museum, and university on the planet. On the other, a date that needs to be true for the entire system to survive. The problem for the Watchtower is not that history is ambiguous. The problem is that archaeology has no religion, and the arithmetic is merciless. If Jerusalem fell in 587 instead of 607, then 2,520 years forward lands you in 1934, not 1914. The starting date collapses, the calculation collapses, and with it, every doctrine built on top of it. Part 8. The Chain Reaction. Because 1914 isn't just a date, it's the first domino. If Jesus began ruling in 1914, then shortly afterward, in 1919, according to Watchtower teaching, he inspected the world's religions and chose the Bible students as his faithful and discreet slave. That appointment is the theological basis for the governing body's authority. It is why members are taught that obeying the organization is the same as obeying God. Remove 1914 and 1919 falls. Remove 1919 and the divine appointment falls. Remove the divine appointment and the governing body becomes what its critics have always said it is, a group of men claiming authority they were never given. This is why 1914 is defended so aggressively. It's not history, it's not prophecy, it's the keystone. Pull it out and the arch comes down. And this is also why questioning 1914 is treated not as intellectual curiosity, but as spiritual treason. Members who raise questions about the date, about 607, about the math, about the reinterpretation, risk being labeled apostates. They risk judicial committees. They risk losing every person they love. The date has become unfalsifiable, not because the evidence supports it, but because the cost of admitting it's wrong is too catastrophic to contemplate. So the question is no longer whether 1914 is historically defensible. The question is, what happens to the people who are told they must never ask? And this is where theology stops being a debate about ideas and becomes a tragedy of real lives. Behind the doctrines and the dates, there are people, real people whose entire lives were architected around a certainty that never came true. Think about what it means to grow up inside apocalyptic urgency. You're told from childhood that this system will end before you grow old. You're told that pursuing higher education is a waste of precious time. You're told that saving for retirement reveals a lack of faith in God's promises. So you skip college. You take a low-paying job that allows more time for preaching. You don't build a career. You don't invest. You don't plan. Because planning for the future is, in this system, an act of disobedience. How many diplomas were never issued? How many grandchildren never met their grandparents because of an exclusion policy driven by the urgency of a date? When you live at the end of the world, you don't build anything for the future. And when the future arrives anyway, it finds you unprepared and dependent. The generation alive in 1914 was supposed to see the end. When that generation began dying, the teaching was adjusted, then adjusted again. In 2010, the overlapping generations doctrine stretched the definition so far that critics noted it had effectively made the timeline open-ended. The deadline was gone, but the urgency remained, and the damage is cumulative. People who postponed education, they can never recover. People who stayed in damaging situations because the end was coming soon and temporary suffering didn't matter. People who cut off family members who left because in the last days, loyalty to the organization eclipses everything, even blood. For some, 1914 was just a number mentioned in a Bible study and memorized for a meeting. For others, it was the operating system of an entire life. Career decisions, relationships, identity. Everything resting on a calculation that begins with a date no historian accepts, passes through a chain of symbolic leaps most scholars reject, and arrives at a year whose original prediction failed publicly and completely. Part 10. The Silence. And here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Most active Jehovah's Witnesses today have never read Russell's original writings about 1914. They don't know the original prediction was about the visible, physical end of all human governments. They don't know the invisible presence doctrine was retrofitted after the failure. They don't know about 1874, 1878, or 1881. They've been given the polished version. The version where 1914 was always about Christ's invisible enthronement, where the outbreak of World War I was always the expected sign, where the teaching has been consistent and divinely guided from the beginning. The original publications that tell a different story are not circulated. They're not discussed in congregation meetings. They're not part of the organization's digital library in any easily accessible form. And seeking them out, going to outside sources, reading academic history, examining the evidence independently, is actively discouraged, not just discouraged, stigmatized, treated as evidence of spiritual contamination. Many members feel that something is wrong when they encounter these facts. But the fear of losing their family is stronger than the desire to understand the history. The organization doesn't need to lock the old books in a vault. It only needs to convince the members that opening those books is an act of disloyalty to God. And so a remarkable situation endures. A religion whose foundational prophetic claim has a documented, verifiable history of failure and revision, and whose membership is largely unaware of that history. Not because the evidence is hidden in some archive. It's not. The old publications exist. The historical record is public. Anyone with an internet connection can read the original Watchtower statements and compare them with what the organization teaches today. But within the culture of the organization, looking is the problem. The act of independent research, of comparing the organization's current claims with its own published history, is itself defined as dangerous, as apostate behavior. And so the silence continues, not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it costs everything. More than a century has passed since 1914. The generation that was alive in that year is gone. The overlapping generation is aging. The end that was supposed to come within living memory of 1914 has not come. And yet the date remains. It sits at the center of the organization's theology like a cracked cornerstone that everyone can see but no one is allowed to touch. Because examining it honestly means confronting a cascade of questions that the system cannot absorb. If the original prediction failed, why should the reinterpretation be trusted? If the starting date is rejected by every relevant academic discipline, why should the calculation be accepted? If the teaching has been revised multiple times, what does that say about the claim of divine guidance? These are not hostile questions. They are not the questions of enemies or persecutors. They are the questions that any honest, thoughtful person would ask when confronted with the full evidence. And yet within the organization, they remain unspoken. Not because the members lack intelligence, but because they have been taught that asking is itself the sin. 1914 is one of the most extraordinary case studies in modern religious history. It demonstrates something that sounds paradoxical, but is profoundly true. A failed prophecy can be more powerful than a successful one. A successful prophecy ends the story. A failed prophecy that is reinterpreted keeps the story going indefinitely. It creates an open-ended state of emergency, a permanent last days, with no expiration date and no way to test whether it's real. It shows how certainty can survive its own refutation, how a belief that was publicly, documentably wrong can be revised just enough to remain plausible, but only if you don't look too closely. And it shows the human cost of prophetic arithmetic, the educations abandoned, the relationships severed, the doubts swallowed, the questions never asked. More than 100 years after the world was supposed to end, 1914 remains the most important date in the theology of Jehovah's Witnesses, and the most vulnerable. Because the final question is not about mathematics or archaeology. It is about freedom. If the foundation of a lifetime of sacrifice is a prophecy that failed and was rewritten in the dark, what is left when you finally turn on the light? If this video made you think, share it with someone who deserves to hear the full history, not the polished version, but the documented one. Subscribe to this channel for more investigations into the claims, the history, and the human cost behind the world's most powerful religious organizations. Hit the notification bell because what's coming next goes even deeper. This is only the beginning.